This is Doug Cook. I use he, him pronouns, and I live on what was Pawtucket land, currently known as South Hamilton, Massachusetts. And I'm in the Ipswich River watershed. I'm the education events coordinator for NOFAMAST, and I'll be your host for tonight. Welcome to Wild Edible and Medicinal Plants with Russ Cohen and Priscila Espinosa. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that this is not a substitute for medical advice. This information is provided for general information only and not intended to provide medical advice and should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I'd like to thank all of the NOFAMAST staff and board members who have helped to make this workshop possible. And thanks to our sponsor, Chelsea Green Publishing, an employee-owned company, brings in-depth practical content about organic gardening and more to life with books, ebooks, and audiobooks. Go to chelseagreen.com and enter code PWEB35 at checkout to receive a special NOFAMAST Resilient Garden Series discount on your next print book purchase. Chelsea Green Publishing, cultivating change from the ground up. Also go check out Ward's Nursery. Ward's Nursery, they pride themselves on being a leader in offering horticultural products you can count on, knowledgeable staff you can trust, and friendly customer service. Ward's Nursery and Garden Center, where gardeners grow, located in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Of course, most importantly, we want to thank all of you, the viewers and listeners, who, especially our members, who make our education and advocacy work possible. Please consider becoming a member and or making a donation to support our work. We like to start off by using this map to remember to acknowledge the land who we occupy and the people who lived here prior to European colonization. We hope that you use this map to find out more about where you are, and please consider learning more about not only the history of the indigenous people who once resided and managed the land where you're living, but also about their current present-day political structures and issues and goals. We suggest you learn more about the ongoing history of Black exclusion from property and farmland ownership. Please consider making solidarity work with local Black and Indigenous groups a part of your environmental and land-based work. We owe so much of what we know about how to grow food and manage land in a way that is regenerative and ecologically responsible, not only to the people who were here before colonization, but the people who were brought to the United States as slaves. And rather than erase them, we should honor and support and seek justice for their descendants who have survived centuries of oppression and white supremacy. I'll drop some links into the chat for a few organizations where you can learn more and follow and support their work. So with that, I want to say thank you. Take a moment to acknowledge and express my gratitude for everyone for sharing this space together. I encourage you to focus on your breath for a moment. Feel the connection with your body and the place that you're in. It's my pleasure to introduce Russ Cohen.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all online. I'd rather see you in person, but we'll do the best we can via cyberspace. So let me just pull up my screen here and get my show to start. So let me just say that this show is organized chronologically by foraging opportunity. And although there are more than 200 species of edible wild plants that grow in Massachusetts, with just 30 minutes, I had to cut it way, way down, and I decided to focus on common species that you can encounter as weeds in organic farms or on the margins of organic farms. Since NOFA is a sponsor, I thought that was an appropriate pairing today. And I do like to make my own special acknowledgement, and that is to thank the indigenous peoples of this region for figuring out which plants were edible, which of course they did for many, many centuries before there were any white people around. So I'm very grateful for that. But I also have 5 decades of experience interacting with these plants myself. So I also base a lot of my knowledge on that too. And if there was any particular writing or teaching I wanted to point you to in terms of covering both plants and the indigenous perspective on plants, it's this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is one of my favorite books, filled with all kinds of wisdom and insights. And I'm very grateful to Robin for writing it and for all her speaking. And I want to just highlight one particular thing in the book, which is this. It's a title, one of the chapters in the book called An Honorable Harvest. And Robin even suggests, and I think it's worth considering, laminating these commandments basically on this page and take it with you whenever you're outside interacting with plants. Now, where this is particularly important is with native species, because native species often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food as some other important portion of their life cycle. So I encourage people to deploy lots of forbearance and restraint when you're gathering native plants or parts of native plants from the wild, just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance or anything. So that's when you have to be particularly careful. But I decided tonight to focus on the other end of the botanical spectrum, the edible weeds and invasive species. So this guidebook was put out about a dozen years ago by the state and a couple nonprofits, and it focused on 66 of what are considered to be the most ecologically disruptive non-native plants that occur in our state. And out of the 66 species this book focuses on, at least 20 of them are edibles. As far as most ecologists are concerned, they'd be thrilled if we picked and ate as many of those as we possibly could, provided that you're not spreading them around in the process, and that is easily avoidable. So this is the guilt-free foraging opportunity end of the spectrum. So we will be looking at a couple of the species that are covered in this book, edible invasive species. But before we get to those, let me talk about my number one species that I'm looking for as I'm out foraging. And this one, in some parts of the state, it'll already be at this stage, or if it's not at this stage, it will be very, very soon. So this is stinging nettle, a plant that you could recognize by getting stung. So if you've never been stung by stinging nettle, it's not like poison ivy where you find out a day or two later that you got into it. You get stung by stinging nettle, you know right away. But on the good side, the sting usually doesn't last more than an hour, and there is an antidote to the sting I'm going to teach you in just a second. So this is usually the first species I'm foraging for, the first green plant I'm foraging for in the spring. And what I would do is just snip off the top of each of these clusters. This is the tender cluster leaves right at the end of the stem. When the plants are about 6 inches tall, that's a great time to get it. And then just throw those in a plastic bag and bring them home. And then just dump the contents of that plastic bag into a bowl filled with water, swish it around. And then I'll take some tongs and fling the washed nettle tops into a cooking pot. And I'm more or less steaming the nettle tops in the water that's still clinging to them for the washing process. So it takes about 5 minutes, and the nettles will shrink quite a bit. And at this stage, the chemical that was responsible for the sting in the raw plant is completely disarmed by steaming, and it turns that chemical into a protein. So stinging nettle greens are about 7% protein, which is a pretty high protein number for a leafy green vegetable. Plus, stinging nettles are loaded with all kinds of other vitamins and minerals like calcium. Stinging nettles are the closest thing I can think of to a vitamin pill in the plant world. They're really good for you. So you could just eat the steamed nettle greens just like this if you wanted to. I find the flavor to be sort of reminiscent of split peas, or there's lots of different ways to use them. Basically, you can use it for a substitute for steamed spinach. So here is cream of stinging nettle soup, something they might have made in the old Addams Family TV show. Very easy recipes in my book. It's just sauteed potatoes and onions thrown in the blender with the steamed nettle greens. Add the chicken stock for those non-vegans out there in the half and half, and it's really lovely. And then there's this recipe, the stinging nettle balls. This is actually the spinach ball recipe from the 1950s, the retro recipe, where the easy way to make it is just use Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix to hold it all together. And you just substitute the steamed nettle greens for the spinach, and it works out really good. All right, so here's a plant that looks a lot like stinging nettle. It does not sting you. And those of you that have sharp eyes will notice the stem has 4 equal sides to it, and the leaves come up opposite for each other. That's your standard structure plants in the mint family. And this is, in fact, a member of the mint family, and it is, in fact, catnip. And catnip has an opposite effect on people than it has on cats. It's a sedative, it's a tranquilizer. So people will drink catnip tea to relax after a stressful day, and you can use the leaves fresh or dried either way. So here's a plant called curled or curly dock, and this is the antidote to the stinging nettle. You just grab some dock leaves and scrunch them up, get the juice out, and then apply that juice where you were stung, and it will help make the sting go away. This is an edible plant too. This is related to our French garden sorrel. The curl dock has got a slight bitterness to it. And it's called curl dock, by the way, because these leaves have these undulating leaf margins on them. So I'll go into the center of the plant, select the newest leaves that are still in the process of being unrolled. Those would be the nicest. And they still have a bit of bitterness to them. So I'll throw them into a pot and blanch them, just boil them for 20 seconds. And that takes the bitterness away. And then you can use it just exactly like cooked spinach. So for example, the blanched dock leaves work really well in spanakopita, the Greek spinach pie with the phyllodoe and the feta cheese, and the steamed nettle greens work really well on that too. And so curl dock has a second season, as do stinging nettles. So occasionally you can find the young stages of those plants in the latter half of the growing season, like in September. So although the main gathering season in the spring, sometimes you get another shot in September. All right, this plant is at or near the top of the botanical list. The ecologists really hate it, and it is a very stubborn, pernicious, invasive species, and it is very disruptive ecologically. Once it gets established, it's really hard to eradicate. So it's bad news ecologically, but it's a really yummy plant. It's not coming up yet, but in a couple weeks, you'll be able to see. First, you want to look for the dried bamboo-like stalks from the previous season, and then it's the Japanese knotweed shoots that come up like this in the spring. And so when the shoot is about a foot tall, that's the wild asparagus stage. You just cut it off at ground level or snap it off with your hands, bring it home, steam it for a few minutes, and eat it hot or cold, like asparagus. But my favorite stage to eat this plant is when the shoots get about 2 feet tall. That's what I call the wild rhubarb stage. And you cut them at ground level, and then you have to peel the very outer skin off because it's stringy. It can get caught in your teeth. So there's nothing poisonous about it. It's just not that good if you're going to cook with a chopped nettle. So the Japanese knotweed. So you peel the very outer layer off, and then it looks like that. And the stalks are tart and juicy. They're kind of like a Granny Smith apple, or you can chop it up like I've done here in the bowl, and then use the chopped up peeled knotweed pieces as a substitute for rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb. So for example, here is my strawberry knotweed pie, recipes in my book, and virtually everybody I serve this pie to say, this is even better than strawberry rhubarb pie. All right, so I encourage you to try it, but you might be looking at this pie and saying, oh, pie crust, I'm a little intimidated by them, and that latticework top, I don't know if I can pull it off. So I'm going to show you a way to use the knotweed pieces that in the last slide that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. Is you can just take those little tart edible hollow containers and fill them with like a salmon mousse or flavored cream cheese and have these delicious little tart appetizers. You do not need to know how to cook to do that. All right, so this photo was taken up in New Hampshire, and that's Mount Washington in the background, but the point of the photo is to talk to you about dandelions. Dandelions are probably responsible for turning more people off of eating wild plants than anything else in the story. It's usually like this, is it's spring and you look out in your backyard, you see all these dandelions blooming, and you say to yourself, oh, I heard dandelions are edible, so I should try them. So you go out to your yard, you pick a few leaves, you bring them indoors, you put a little oil and vinegar on them, you take a bite. It's incredibly bitter. You spit it out, you say, yuck, I'm never going to eat a wild plant again, which is a shame because dandelions are great if you eat the right part at the right time. So what is that and when is that? When I start seeing whole fields turning yellow with dandelion flowers like I am here, I personally consider it too late to be eating dandelions. I mean, you could eat the flowers, it'd be fine then, but if you're going to eat the rest of the plant, you want to get it before the flowers bloom. In fact, it is the unopened flowers, the flower buds, that I consider to be the tastiest part of dandelions. In fact, I consider dandelion flower buds to be among the tastiest vegetables of anything, cultivated or wild. They're like a cross between corn, spinach, Brussels sprouts, and artichoke hearts. So you pick the buds off, and I'll tell you what to do with them in just a second. Now, each bud is only about a 1/4 inch in diameter. And so you might look at a bud and say, well, how am I going to feed my family with this teeny little dandelion bud? Well, if you go to an organic farm, as I suggested, a good place to look for foraging, and get permission from the managers first. Don't just go and start foraging. Make sure they're okay with it. But I often see large dandelion plants on the edges of the cultivated organic farm field. And I have found individual dandelion plants with over 200 buds per plant. So yeah, it takes a little while to pull them off. But if you're finding dandelion plants like that, you can find all you need to feed your family, dinner guests. Once we can have dinner guests again, won't that be great? And so what I do is I pull the buds off the plant, put them in that bowl of water, swish them around to clean them up, get a pot of water boiling in the stove, dump the dandelion buds in, and cook them for 60 seconds. That's it. That's all they need. And then you can incorporate them in soups and omelets and casseroles. But before you do anything with them, before you even put any salt or butter on them, just try them plain, and I think you'll be amazed at how tasty they are. And if you want to eat dandelion leaves, this is the time to get them. So when I'm pulling the buds off the plants, if I see any tender leaves in the center of the plant, I'll harvest them too and just prepare them the same way. All right, so this slide is a little out of chronological sequence, but this plant is very closely related to dandelions. This is chicory, and these blue flowers are edible. They don't have a lot of flavor, but blue's an unusual food color, so it's fun to just snip the petals off and add them to a salad. And then chicory leaves are edible in the spring or in the fall. In the summer, they're way, way too bitter to be enjoyable. But probably the part you've heard of when you hear about chicory is the chicory roots, and it's to make a beverage from the roots. And this is explained in my book, but basically you dig up the roots and then roast them slowly in an oven till they're brittle and aromatic, and then you grind them up in a food processor, and then you brew them just like you brew coffee. And the drink that you make tastes amazingly like coffee, especially if you usually drink your coffee with cream and sugar, and you drink the chicory the same way. The flavor is really similar. The big difference is chicory does not have caffeine in it. So if you're one of these people who says, well, what's the point of drinking it if there's no caffeine in it, then the chicory is just not going to cut it for you. So here is chickweed, really common spring and fall wild edible in organic gardens and farms. And this one I use as a sprout substitute and a sandwich or lettuce substitute and a salad. Plantains. So this is an edible and medicinal plant. I probably think more of the medicinal parts than the edible parts. You can eat young plantain leaves raw. You can cook with them. You can steam them or boil them. You can make like a pureed soup with them, almost like a split pea soup. The two medicinal parts are, this is the flower bud, but after the flowers bloom, it's going to form a brownish green seed head. And the mature seeds of our common plantain, this Plantago major, are related to a plant called Plantago psyllium, which is a source of psyllium husks, which is the active ingredient in several commercial laxatives like Metamucil. So you could use our wild plantain seeds the same way. I'm not exactly sure what the dosage is, but I'm going to guess that a teaspoonful of the ripe seeds drunk down with a glass of water, that would do the trick. The other medicinal use for the plantain leaves is as a styptic to put on any cuts, scrapes, insect bites, splinters, bee stings, any skin irritations. You can slap the leaf and put it right on there, or you can scruff it up a little bit and put it on there, or you can put it in your mouth and chew it briefly and mix it with your saliva, which also has therapeutic properties. You could do that. Or if you have a larger area, you can gather up a bunch of leaves and boil them briefly to soften them up, and then you can make a poultice over the affected area. Here's lamb's quarters, really common farm and garden weed, and this dust in the center of each plant isn't produced by the roadside or anything. That's a natural mealiness the plant produces on its own. It's one of the ways to help identify the plant. This is in fact a cousin of spinach. It's called wild spinach. It has more vitamins than spinach. You can use it exactly like spinach. You can eat the leaves raw. You can steam them. You don't have to boil them. Lamb's quarters is also an excellent substitute for spinach and the spanakopita. So this photo was taken in early June. Occasionally you will find lamb's quarters at this stage later on in the season, sometimes as late as November, because this is a very opportunistic farm and garden weed. So as long as the ground is disturbed, the seeds will germinate and keep trying to produce younger crops later on in the season. Okay, so this is the only part of this plant that's not edible. The rest of it is. This is a plant that, this part you'll recognize when you get home and you find these in your socks, your dog's fur. And the guy who invented Velcro did get the idea from these burrs, by the way. So this is a plant aptly called burdock. It's an edible and a medicinal plant. I'm going to talk about the edible parts. The main medicinal part, by the way, is the root. I'm going to talk about eating the root too. So burdock is a biennial species. It has a 2-year lifestyle. This is what it's going to look like a few weeks from now. And this is a 2nd-year plant. And there's a big taproot. Now, unfortunately, you can't just yank on the foliage and get the root out that way. They will break on you. So you have to dig these roots up. And there's a lot of work, and I'm too lazy to do that. So instead, let me just say, if you did dig up the root, one standard way to cook it and eat it is just wash it off. You don't have to peel it. Slice it into half-inch thick rounds. Boil it in salted water till it's tender, about 15 minutes, and then it will taste like a starchy artichoke. But as I said, I'm too lazy to do that. Instead, what I do is I eat the developing cylindrical flower stalk in the center of the plant, which is right here. So in the Boston area, it's going to be at this stage around the first week of June. So I'm cutting this at ground level, lopping off the top cluster leaves. So you can see all these stalks I gathered in less than a half an hour. So that's much faster than digging up the roots. Now I understand that this is not as valuable medicinally, but it tastes as good. And so if you want medicinal stuff, go for the root. But if you're just interested in, gathering a whole bunch of, burdock is a plant that you can really fill up on. So because unlike the knotweed, these stalks are solid all the way through. So you do have to peel the outer layer of the burdock stalks because it's bitter and stringy. But once you get all that off, the inner part is like an elongated artichoke heart. So you chop it up like this, boil it in salted water until it's tender, which is only about 5 minutes. And then it's good just plain. It's good thrown in spaghetti sauce. So it's really good in the recipe. Well, ordinarily, you would take artichoke hearts and Parmesan cheese and mayonnaise and breadcrumbs, and you mix it all together. and you bake it in the oven. It's a spread you put on crackers, where you could substitute the boiled burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts in that recipe. It works great. And this is what it looks like. And that recipe is on my website. So at the end of the show, at the end of my part of the show, I'll show you the link to where to find me. Maybe Doug can drop that in the chat. And then you'll find my recipe page where I have this and a bunch of other recipes listed. All right, Purslane. This is a plant Priscilla is also going to talk about. It's a nutritional powerhouse. It's also really edible. It's edible raw. It's edible cooked. The leaves are edible. The stems are edible. The thicker stems people actually make pickles from. And I'm going to show you a really easy way to use the purslane that requires no cooking skill whatsoever, although you certainly could make your own gazpacho from your own homegrown vegetables, the ones you buy at the organic farm stand. But if you're lazy and you just want to buy the pre-made gazpacho, you could just throw the purslane leaves in that gazpacho, and the texture of the purslane leaves works really well in a gazpacho. So purslane is a hot weather weed. It's a summer weed. Okay, so blackberry, I don't need how to tell you how to eat a blackberry. I'm sure you figured that out. I just will mention that blackberry is a medicinal plant too. The medicinal part are the leaves, and you can make a tea from blackberry leaves. Probably this young leaf is going to make the best tasting tea. And the tea has vitamin C in it, which has its own medicinal value. But what I understand is that blackberry leaves are an effective remedy for both constipation and diarrhea, which is a neat trick, that the leaf should be active at both ends of the spectrum there. All right, so here's the common mallow, and all plants in the mallow family have the demulcent quality, the mucilaginous quality that has medicinal value in terms of, calming an upset digestive system. This plant's edible too. The leaves are edible, but the funnest part to eat are these little guys here that look like little miniature green cheese wheels. And back in the day when kids used to play with plants, before they had, all these modern high-tech distractions, they would look for these in the vacant lots and by the roadside and stuff, and these little cheeses. Yeah, so you can use these raw, you can cook them, and they do have a mucilaginous quality like okra in cooking. All right, so here is autumn olive. This is the last plant I'm going to talk about in my show tonight. So this is another invasive species, and it's all over the place in Massachusetts, thanks in large part to the Mass Highway Department that planted many, many hundreds of these plants along interstates and other big roads like that, particularly in the 60s and the 70s. By the 1980s, they figured out, to their regret, that this plant is an invasive species. But anyway, so the plant blooms in May, and it's covered with these blossoms that have a very pleasant smell. There's a close-up of what the flowers look like. And here's what the berries look like. So it's called autumn olive because the fruit is ripe in the fall, and they often grow in tremendous quantities on the branches like this. There's a whole chapter on autumn olive in my book if you want to learn more about this species. And these are ripe in the fall, and the flavor will vary from bush to bush. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, and other times they can be quite sweet, like a green Thompson seedless grape. These fruits have seeds in them, which you can swallow or spit out. It doesn't really matter. And each individual fruit is about the size of a pea. And I'm going to show you a close-up of what they look like. So they have these little silvery white speckles on them. And so let me just go back a slide here. So the fruit is ripe when it comes off at just the very slightest tickle. So if you have to kind of yank on the fruit, it's not ripe yet. Just give it a very tickle. And because it grows in such great gobs on the branches, you could just stick your bucket or your basket underneath a branch like this, and they're usually bent down for the weight of the fruit. And you just tickle, 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 and your basket or bucket is filling up with the autumn olive fruit. All right, so this is a photo I took a couple years ago when there was a drought and there just wasn't a good production on the autumn olive fruit. So ordinarily, I could easily fill a basket like this, but I had a meager crop that year. But anyway, I want to tell you what I do with autumn olives. So what I do, and this is you could eat them raw, as I mentioned before, but I make a puree from the autumn olive. And so I bring the fruit home. I pick out any leaves or any rotted fruit that fell into my bucket or basket. And then I fill a bowl like this with water. I dump the fruits in and then wash it. And then I put it in a pot, like a big pot, like a lobster pot, with just enough water in the bottom of the pot to keep the fruit from scorching, like a third of an inch, a half an inch. And I simmer it for a while to soften up the fruit. It's about a half an hour. And I put everything through this food mill, and all the seeds are held back and all the pulp and the juice goes through. So you see, there's the leftover seeds. And by the way, I put all these seeds in my compost pile, and I have a very, I don't have a fancy compost system at all. It's basically a pile in my backyard. So it doesn't get particularly warm or anything. And only once in the more than 24 years that I've been putting the autumn olive seeds in there, that I have a couple autumn olive seeds sprout and try to grow into plants in my raised beds where I use my compost. So I don't worry about putting autumn olive seeds in my compost. Remember, this is an invasive species, so that's why ordinarily you would be concerned about that. But at least my personal anecdotal experiences, it's not a problem. All right, so here is the puree that comes after you put it through the food mill. And so at this stage, you can use this as raw material for making autumn olive jam, autumn olive jelly, autumn olive sorbet, autumn olive chiffon pie, stuff like that. I like to make an autumn olive fruit leather. So I get out my food dehydrator and I just pour the puree into these trays, that inserts that hold liquids, and just as many as much pulp as I have, that's how many trays I put on there, and I let it run overnight, and what I get is just this wonderful fruit leather that I cut up into little bite-sized pieces. And were this to be a live program tonight, I would be feeding you autumn olive fruit leather as part of the refreshments I love to share in my talk. And autumn olive does make a delicious wine, and let me just say that the USDA did a study on autumn olive fruit pulp a few years back, and besides finding it had vitamin C in it, they found that the autumn olive fruit pulp is up to 18 times higher in lycopene than tomatoes. So I'm hearing more and more good stuff about lycopene. So here you go, an unusually rich source of lycopene that's all over the place in our environment. It's invasive species, so complete guilt-free foraging opportunity. And let me just say one more thing about, okay, so I told you that this plant was planted a lot along highways. Now, you don't have to endanger your life running out to the median strip to pick this stuff. In fact, you probably wouldn't want to pick it next to a highway because there's lots of cars there. There's lots of, automobile exhaust and stuff like that might build up on the plants and make the fruits not particularly healthy to eat next to a busy highway. But if you look near where those spots are, like any exit off those highways, we're seeing autumn olives. You often see autumn olives in the side streets near where the highways are, where it's spread to that area. Anywhere where there are gravel pits near those highways, you'll often find autumn olives, because this species can do what plants in the pea family can do. It has nitrogen-fixing nodules on its root systems, so it can grow in the nutrient-poor soil, and that's why the highway departments used it a lot, because they could grow it in that crappy soil that's left over after you build a highway. All right, so there is the fruit leather, and yes, autumn olive makes a delicious wine too. And this vintner got berries from me and then gave me a case of wine afterwards, which is really great to know. All right, so that is the end of my show, and I'll just leave this slide up for a minute, but this information, I think we'll put it in the chat too. This book that I keep mentioning, it's got several of the plants we talked about today, like the autumn olive here and the Japanese knotweed, and 44 other species of plants that I wasn't able to get to tonight, including the stinging nettle. There's a chapter in there with those recipes I mentioned. And although the books cost $15, I don't keep any of that money. I give it all to the land trust that published the book, because if you want to know, well, where can I go foraging? Greenbelt, the Essex County Greenbelt Association, they allow foraging as a permitted activity on all their properties that are open to the public, which is dozens of properties covering hundreds of acres. And I'm so grateful for that. I said, just keep all the money the book makes and just buy more land with it. So you just go to ecga.org and just pull up their property maps, and you can just go start foraging. All right, with that, so please think of any questions and I'll answer them after Priscilla is done. And it's great talking to you. And sorry it had to be so short, but I do lots of other talks. If you go to this link right here, you get to my webpage, you can see where else I do talks. That will be longer. I cover more plants, and I have scheduled some in-person walks this year. Who knows, we might have to be masked and socially distanced, but at least we'll be outside walking around looking at actual plants. So I hope to see you on one of those. All right, thank you, and I will talk to you during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Russ. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Priscila Espinosa.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be presenting on wild and medicinal plants that I'm familiar with and I've used in my own presentations, demo presentations, as well as in my life. And so I'm the founder of SproutChange, helping you sprout change in your life using food as medicine, natural remedies, and herbs. And let me just get Our social mission is to empower everyday people to reclaim their health autonomously, and our vision is to go from a local to global grassroots movements where everyday people become resilient using a healing foods diet and lifestyle, as well as regenerating our shared earth and natural resources. As Doug mentioned, this is not a substitute for medical advice. And I just want to share this before I go into the herbs. A lot of the reason why I do this work is because our current healthcare system, our medical doctors are actually not equipped to speak to us about healing foods and nutrition, because less than 1% of their curriculum is focused on nutrition. So if you want to look at a doctor who can support you with healing foods, you're going to want to look at a naturopathic doctor or a functional medicine doctor. So I just want to share, explain that. Additionally, I found working with my clients that some of the top daily nutrients that we need are omega-3s. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later on when I share my favorite way to get omega-3 in the summertime. Iodine, which has antiviral properties. Zinc, which is good for our immunity. Magnesium, vitamin D, also support our nervous system and immunity. Iron, calcium, B vitamins, which are important for our overall mental health and nervous system. Vitamin C, which helps us repair and regenerate. Resistant starch, which helps us give us energy. It's a type of starch that is actually very slow to digest, and it's beneficial for probiotics in our gut. Probiotics, prebiotics, which is fiber, which feeds the probiotics, and chlorophyll, which we get from a lot of the wild and medicinal plants. So that's a wonderful way. If you're not getting enough chlorophyll, the green part in the plant, in your diet, definitely consider foraging to supplement your diet this way. Around this time of year, this picture was actually taken in April, you're going to start seeing these heart-shaped leaves, and this is young garlic mustard. It's the ideal time to eat it in salads like at this moment, and garlic mustard is actually wonderful for lung health. So curiously, a lot of the pictures I'm going to be showing you, I'm going to focus on those speak a little bit more on those that are good for lung health because of the time that we're in during the pandemic. So we want to give ourselves optimal opportunity to have a healthy upper respiratory system. Garlic mustard is also a good antiseptic and wonderful with asthma and eczema. This is wild onion, and I have a recipe here where I just added them to my beans. And wild onions are really high in sulfur. So is wild garlic, but in this case, I foraged some wild onion. And a lot of the plants that I'll be showing you are quite invasive. So you can just yank it up with the whole root and enjoy the medicinal benefits from it. And so it does have an onion taste to it, and the chives part, I'll add it raw to salads, or I'll add it to make a pesto. And so sulfur, we actually need to repair our genetic makeup. And so sulfur, like if you think of like a sulfur hot spring, a lot of people go to sulfur hot springs for joint pain to alleviate. And so sulfur is an element that we really need to help our body regenerate. And so you can get this from wild garlic and wild onions. This is young violet leaves, and also a picture from April. Violet leaves are wonderful for lung health. They're a demulcent, so they're going to help you be able to cough up phlegm. They're very soothing, so if you have a dry cough, this is a wonderful herb to take at this time of year, or to dehydrate it and have it all year round. So I know that if I have a terrible cough or a dry cough, I just dehydrate the leaves, because the violets actually have a very short, well, not necessarily short, but like the flowers have a very short season. But the leaves, they may not always be around. So you want to really start looking out for them around April through, I would say, June, July. And you know, if you're in an undisturbed area, they should be available till the full season, till the winter comes. We also have available now purple death nettle. This you could forage amply around April to July. Also very invasive, so don't feel bad picking it up. And this is a wonderful herb that is wonderful as an antimicrobial, as an antifungal, also great for lung health. It has antihistamine properties and it's anti-inflammatory. And this is a close-up of purple dead nettle, and it tastes a little musky to me. Like it has like a mild mint. It's part of the mint family, so it has a mild mint taste. You're not going to get that taste that you think like from mint where it's aromatic. I think the aroma is a little musky, but the aftertaste it has a mild mint taste when you think of like the mint that you're used to. Something that I like to do this time of year is I like to collect all these wild herbs and I make a stir fry. And so I combine some store-bought vegetables like cabbage, and then I have some kale that overwintered and still is hanging around. I have some sprouted lentils, and I mix all the wild foods as well as some store-bought foods, and I make a stir fry. So it's a little bit of some things that you do yourself, some things that you collect from nature, and some things that you get from the store. And this helps to expand your wallet. And it's also a wonderful way, I feel, eating wild foods to build your resilience. So this is a resilient garden series. So I like the name of the Resilient Garden series, but think of yourself as a resilient person. When you're eating wild foods are very resilient. They come back every year. They're very strong. And so you're actually getting that wild energy from the plants. And so consider incorporating them if you're feeling lethargic, low energy, really need a boost, have nature give you that extra boost. And so this is a plate of a bunch of wild edibles, very young leaves. And another way that I like doing them, this is something that I collected in April. I like mixing them with some spring mix and making a bit of a wild salad or pesto. And so these, on the left, I have some pesto on a matzo cracker, and then I have a wild salad. And when the leaves are young, the taste is much more mild. When the leaves are older, the wild leaves, they tend to be a more pronounced flavor. And so this is later in the season. So next month in May, we're gonna get the violet flowers, and the leaves are much bigger. And so I like collecting them and dehydrating them for further use. And so here I'm going to talk a little bit about omega-3s, which is wonderful for our mental health. And we can get them from seeds like flax seeds and chia seeds and hemp seeds, from cruciferous vegetables like cabbages. But a wonderful way that we can get them is from purslane, which Russ was speaking about, which actually has the highest plant-based source of omega-3. And so as Russ mentioned, ask a farmer for permission to go forage on their field, because it grows everywhere. And you might be lucky enough to have it on your property, or when you're walking next or hiking. It is very resilient as a plant. Like, it loves to grow even in really dry areas. So keep a lookout for it. And this is a salad. I've seen purslane in every climate that I've been to in the summertime. So this is in the south of France. It was drought-like conditions, very dry, and the purslane was it was just really living it up, very healthy. And we had it very simple with just a little bit of lemon and olive oil and salt and tomatoes, and that was the dish. And so we're getting some omegas, some chlorophyll, and enjoying some fresh food. This is a client testimonial who Jorge was able to reduce his Crohn's disease by incorporating medicinal foods, natural remedies, and herbs. And so we did a whole change in his diet and lifestyle. And so this goes to a testament to the power of medicinal foods. I'm going to be transitioning now to the demo part of the evening. This is Mullen Leaf, and I love Mullen Leaf. I think it's available year round. Everywhere I've been, there's either a very young plant. I think that even in the snow time, it's such a resilient plant. It does, in the summertime, it gets very tall, as you see on the left. In the springtime, it's very young, as you see on the upper right. The leaves are very small. And by the summertime, you have these really big, long, fat leaves if the plant has not been disturbed. I had on the bottom, I made a fresh mullen leaf poultice because I couldn't find plantain, which I normally would use. And I had this awful bite. And so I just mashed it up and it worked just as well. And I was very happy with the results. It was anti-inflammatory. So that was a nice discovery. You know, when you can't find plantain, you know, maybe you have some mullen. And so I'm going to go into the demo part. How are we doing with audio? Can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So we're gonna, if you can share the screen, the PowerPoint screen, and then you only see my hands, you'll be able to see the recipe that I'm gonna do for the poultice. It's very simple. So I'm gonna take some plantain leaf that I had already dehydrated, and I'm gonna be putting it in a mortar and pestle. And I'll show you the leaves. I like dehydrating the leaves and keeping them available year round until I need them. And we'll go up one slide. The poultice is before the herbal infusion. There we go. And so that way you can see the recipe. It's very simple. I can just show you the tutorial. You're just using a little bit of the poultice, a little bit of the herb. And you can usually make a poultice out of most herbs that are anti-inflammatory. So plantain is a very well-known herb. Many mothers use it, and you might be familiar growing up where maybe your mom chewed a little bit of fresh plantain leaf and then spat it out, and that's called a spit poultice. So this one's gonna be a dry one, and I'm just gonna mash it up, make a powder. You can use a spice blender. So with the mortar and pestle, you get the powder very quickly. So now that we have a bit of a powder, we're gonna put this in here in a little bowl, and you're gonna want to mix it with almost equal parts water. Probably just start with a little bit less. And the wonderful thing about plantain is that it's actually very healing in as far as restoring and healing. Like it'll actually help you grow new skin. So it'll speed up the healing process. And let me get some water. And so maybe you can see this. It's very little. And so I'll use just like maybe a couple drops of water and I'll spin it. And I think because I don't have any scarring or anything that's the matter right now, I think I'll just save it to make a facial mask. And I'll put this as a facial mask to just kind of give myself a youthful face glow. So if you're not really hurting, consider adding this to your face mask routine. So I'm going to save this for later and do a do-it-yourself face mask. But if I had a cut, I would apply the poultice on the affected area, and I could leave it alone like that, or I could put a bandage over it or some cloth and wrap it up. But I'm going to use it for a face mask. Now we can go to the next slide for the herbal infusion. The way I was taught in a lifestyle and wellness center when I was training to be a health coach to make an herbal infusion is 1 tablespoon to 1 cup of water, or 3 tablespoons to 1 quart of water. And so I like using glass jars. I prefer to do my herbs using glass, ceramic, or stainless steel. And I only do the stainless steel in an emergency or if I have to make a very large batch, but I prefer to do, even use large half-gallon mason jars. So I'm gonna look where the 1 cup mark is. And I already boiled some water in advance. And I'm making an infusion of mullen leaf, and this mullen leaf is already dehydrated and pre-measured. And so I'm gonna add a tablespoon of mullen leaf. And then I am going to add some hot water, and I'm going to have it steep for about 10 minutes. If you let it steep longer, the color will intensify. And so I'm going to look where you can add more than 1 cup of water. It'll just be a bit thinner in taste. And I like it nice and strong. So I'm gonna, with a rich taste, I'm gonna keep it here. And as I mentioned earlier, Mullen Leaf has antiviral benefits. And so this is my go-to during this time of season with the pandemic. That's how I'm keeping my immunity high. It's also wonderful for lung health. It's an expectorant. And it's been proven antiviral against influenza and herpes. I mean, there's nothing known about COVID-19. And again, this is not a substitute for medical advice. So, if you're researching, COVID-19 and Mullen, I don't think you're going to find any conclusive scientific research on it, but you will find scientific research through the Natural Institute of Health and PubMed, the National Libraries of Medicine, through the United States of America for Mullen Leaf. So I highly recommend you to look into that. And this will let it steep for about 10 minutes. And I'll show you what it looks like once it's steeped. This has been steeping for 30 minutes. It's cooled off and there's still some floating. So, I have Russian friends that like to add more water. So obviously the second batch is not going to be as rich in flavor as the first batch. I find the flavor to be very mild. So if you're concerned about, I think it's a little bit more mild than green tea. I don't think it has any particular taste. And then I take a strainer and I strain it into a cup. So I'll do that right now so I can show you the nice color that it has. It has like a bit of a light brown yellow color. Other ways that I use Mullen Leaf is when I make cultured vegetables. I make a tea in advance and I add the Mullen Leaf infusion as my water. So when you're making cultured vegetables, you want to add water. And so that's what it looks like. And I'll be enjoying this tonight and tomorrow. Next, we're going to go into the herbal oil infusion. So I'm going to make a very small batch of infused herbal oil because I already have plenty that I've made. This one was made with dehydrated garlic mustard. Garlic mustard has this really pretty white flower, and garlic mustard, the leaves when crushed have a bit of a garlic taste to it. So I was just experimenting. I don't think that this oil is going to pick up the garlic hint to it because I used so little of it. If I had, filled up the whole jar with garlic mustard leaves, I'm sure that the taste would be more pronounced, but I just thought it was so beautiful. I mean, it's like almost decorative and so very pleasant to the eye. You can make an herbal infused oil with anything, any dehydrated, preferably dehydrated. There are some herbalists that will teach you how to make an oil infusion with fresh herbs and making sure that the herb is completely covered. However, if you're very new to infusing oils, I would say start with dehydrated herbs. It's the safest way to make sure that you don't mess up the recipe. And what you can do with the oil is for cooking or for skin treatments, for hair treatment. You can also use it for salad dressings. And so this one, I'm going to be making it with turmeric. I'm using turmeric powder. Again, I'm using a very small container, but you can use a bigger container. You can go as big as half a gallon or a gallon mason jar if you'd like. And I'm going to be using turmeric powder. You can use dehydrated ground turmeric root. I just buy my turmeric in bulk, and so I have a bunch of it, and so I'm going to put at least, I would say like this much, probably like half an inch, but you can follow the recipe for the herbal infused oil. That one, it's more palatable to a lot of people. If you want something that's very flavorful, but this, I'm demoing a very basic way of doing it for my own purposes and maybe for yours. I use turmeric almost every day for healing because of its wonderful anti-inflammatory properties, and it also functions as an antidepressant and good for your joints because it's anti-inflammatory. And It also helps regenerate our DNA. And so I have about this much, 25 milliliters of turmeric. And I'm gonna now fill it to the top with oil. And I know that I'll be using this oil more often in my kitchen or for salad dressing. Because I'm using a lot of oil compared to a lot of turmeric powder compared to the oil, this oil will be very dark gold once it's done. And I'm gonna do a sun infusion. So the recipe that I'm sharing here is if you slow cook it in a slow cooker or stovetop, but I'm gonna do a solar infused oil. And all I have to do is add the oil. It's already in a glass jar. I could put it in a paper bag so that it doesn't become rancid. It'll help with reducing the oil from getting rancid. I'm using a high quality grapeseed oil, which is good. It withstands high heat levels, and so I feel that it'll withstand. It won't go rancid as quickly as, let's say, if you use olive oil. And I will put it in indirect sunlight, and I'll do that for about 2 weeks, and then you want to shake it almost every day. And after 2 weeks, you get a nice golden yellow. So I have this nice grapeseed oil that I'm gonna put on the top. I'm gonna give it a good shake. I'm gonna put a little bit of wax paper on the top, just so that when I've done a lot of oils, infused oils, herb infused oils, sometimes after 2 weeks, the oil gets a little cakey, like a little on the rims of the mason jar lids. So now I'm putting wax paper on the top so that it doesn't affect the metal and it doesn't like stick to the metal. And I'll give it a good shake now. Already it's gonna give it a nice, beautiful golden color. But I'm not gonna touch this. I'm just gonna shake it almost every day. And then it looks viscousy right now, but actually once the turmeric floats to the bottom, it'll separate and the oil will be on top. And you can actually like lightly use it if you don't wanna strain it. And then the remaining turmeric, I'll scoop it up and use it when I'm making my rice dishes or curry dishes. And so nothing goes to waste. And I believe there might be another picture, another slide. Follow us at handle MySproutChange. And I too look forward to answering some of your questions at the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks, Priscilla, for all that great information. Again, if you really love these programs, these events, please become a NOFAMAS member or consider making a donation to help support our important work. Now we can jump into some of these questions that have been coming in. I think I'd like to start off with some of the concern around where to harvest some of our wild edibles. Could you both talk a little bit more about where things to avoid again when you're harvesting your wild edibles?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Russ.
All right, so I avoid picking, as I mentioned, along heavily traveled roadways, places where everybody takes their dog for a walk, although if something is growing above a certain height, even a Great Dane can't reach it, so I don't worry that much about that. I avoid harvesting in really fussed over areas, so really manicured areas like closely cropped lawns and golf courses where it's likely that people are using nasty chemicals to subdue the stuff they don't like. So I tend to go for shaggy, more out of the way places. I mean, somebody asked a question about lead, and yes, lead is a potential concern if you're eating the leaves of something that's growing in a soil that's got a high lead content. But I understand that fruits that are growing in soil that has some lead in it are less of a concern than the leaves are, because less lead gets into the fruits. So like a blueberry bush would be less of a concern than, say, you growing lettuce in a soil that had lead in it. So I mentioned organic farms, and I love to do programs in NOFA to promote organic farms as foraging places. And of course, I need to not deter you in any way from patronizing the organic farms at the farm stands, getting a CSA share if that'll work for you, because as many edible weeds and invasive species there aren't enough to make a significant dent in our food supply. So we really need to grow food. Organic is a great way to do it. But in addition to that, organic farms make great foraging places. So why is that? Reason number one is the obvious one. They're not slathering everything with chemicals. Reason number two is the way they manage weeds at organic farms. They do it strategically. They're not weeding every square inch every single day. They weed where they need to, and they don't weed where they don't need to. And so if you time your visit right to an organic farm, you can often find huge amount of weeds, enough to feed whole armies. So if I've got a big dinner party planned, which I haven't done lately, but which I hope to do again in the future, and I need lots of raw material, I can go to organic farm and find all I need that way. And then all the wonderful stuff that's in the living organic soil that makes the organically grown fruits and vegetables so nutritious to eat, all that good stuff is getting in the weeds too. So the weeds you harvest at organic farms are going to be more nutritious and luscious and basically better than, let's say, a weed growing in a crack in a sidewalk. And then the last reason is the edges of organic farms often have good edge species like fruit trees, nut trees, berry bushes, stuff like that. So my advice is form a symbiotic relationship with your local organic farmer, because they have the weeds, you want the weeds, so potentially it's a great partnership. So once again, don't just go there and start foraging. You need to talk to somebody and make sure they're okay with it. And actually I advise that on any foraging you do, if it's possible to find somebody and ask, the landowner, land manager, stuff like that. And they say, good, then you can really forage in a joyful way, and you don't have to be looking over your shoulder saying, is anybody going to, get mad at me for doing what I'm doing? So, and another thing, if you actually talk to somebody at the farm, they'll often tell you the best place to go foraging, because they'll know where they haven't been weeding. So let's say it's the summer and you want to look for purslane, they'll say, oh yeah, purslane, go over there. That field is full of it. We haven't touched that field in a while. And that'll save you some time and guesswork.
There's some questions about, should we be cautious about avoiding any look-alike plants when we're out there? There was a little bit of a conversation about purple dead nettle and creeping Charlie, for example.
Do you want to take that, Priscilla? I'll go ahead.
Sure. I'm actually not very familiar with like the common name creepy Charlie, and I'm wondering if it's henbit, which I also noticed in the chat that some people, henbit and purple dead nettle are easily mistaken. And the way you can tell them apart is that purple dead nettle has, the leaves are heart-shaped, and they're not directly like together, they're kind of alternating. And henbit looks like little claws. So they kind of like go all around like a little skirt, and they have little claws. And so you can tell, I tell them apart like that. Like the leaves of the purple dead nettle are more heart, kind of like garlic mustard when it's young, and henbit has little claws on it, like clam. It looks like a clam. Do you know, Russ?
All right, so I'm going to do a sweeping generalization, which is generally dangerous to do in the foraging world, but I'm happy to tell you there are no poisonous species of mints that grow around here. So it doesn't mean they all taste good. Like motherwort, for example, is an important medicinal plant that tastes horrible. So, but most mints taste good. Oh, there we go. So most mints taste good, and mints, by the way, culinary speaking, they separate into two basic groups. There's the savory mints and the sweet mints, and the sweet mint would be like spearmint or peppermint that you use for like mid-julep, mid-tea, mid-ice cream, mid-candy, stuff like that. And then there's the savory mints like sage and thyme that you use for like pizza topping, sausage making, soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that. And so depending upon what the mint is, it generally falls into one or the other of those categories.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. I wanted to share, somebody had mentioned that turmeric needs to have black pepper, and that's true. That's for bioabsorption. So that boosts the bioabsorption up to 2000%. It's not like a must. It's not mandatory. You're still going to get turmeric benefits by infusing the oil. It's actually going to go into the oil. And so you'll still have medicinal benefits, and actually you can use it even for skin treatment. But if you're specifically using the turmeric to, let's say, to deal with joint pain, specifically, or like for culinary purposes, like in India. In fact, a lot of curries have already, the curry mix already has the turmeric and the black pepper and also other types of spices. And together they bring out a lot of spices and herbs. They need another element or herb or spice active property to make it bioabsorbable. For instance, like we don't absorb calcium unless we have vitamin D. So you're either supplementing vitamin D or you're eating a calcium-rich breakfast and you're going outside to get that sunshine to be able to absorb the calcium. So actually that's very common. Like iron can only be bioabsorbed with vitamin C. So if I'm gonna eat iron-rich legumes, beans in my salad or a meal, or leafy greens that have iron, I'm going to sprinkle lemon juice on top, which is rich in vitamin C, or some cayenne pepper to make sure that I'm absorbing the iron. So that it doesn't just happen with turmeric, it happens with many, many elements and vitamins and minerals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a few questions about blackberry. What is the best time to harvest your blackberry leaves or raspberry leaves?
Oh, well, for you know, the young and tender leaves are generally better. You're going to find those obviously mostly in the spring, but you can usually find them into the summer. You know, by probably Labor Day, all the young leaves will be gone. And I just think the younger leaves will tend to be have a less bitter flavor. The other ones, in fact, I find that, you know, tea made from rubus species leaves taste somewhat like the fruit, as does tea that you make from wild strawberries. So let me just add, in terms of making tea from anything in the rubus genus, or actually wild strawberry too, you should use fresh or thoroughly dried leaves. Apparently when the leaves are wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine.
Well, that's a good segue to talk a little bit about drying. If you don't have a dehydrator, can you air dry herbs? And what are some of the considerations we like to think about when we're drying and preserving our herbs that way?
So I'll share a little bit, and I'm sure Russ also had some great feedback on how he dehydrates. So I shared a picture where I just took the trays, like in the summertime when it's warm, and even when it's just not cold, very cold, as long as it's not damp and humid, I have like a lot of sufficient air in my home. I just use the dehydrator trays and I stack the leaves on it and I let it air dry. Other ways is you can wrap up, this is from the late summer, some mugwort, and so I just like loosely fold it over so that it's not everywhere, it's manageable. And I just upcycle a little bit of, you know, like I don't know what this is called, it's like the wire from bread, and I just upcycled it, and then I hang it. And I have a section in my kitchen where there's no direct sunlight, so I just hang it in a corner and it dries as long as it needs to dry. Another way that you can use it is you can take your clips, you know, and you can just clip the herbs very quickly. And then hang it up. So you can use string, you can use whatever materials you have, or you can lay it flat. So those are my techniques that I use.
Good for Priscilla to have all those props like right on hand to just grab them. That's excellent. So I'm sort of dependent on the computer here. My image is on the screen, but you know, the standard way of just hanging an herb upside down and just putting it in the airy spot that's dry, and just, I mean, that works for wild plants too. So there's no magic difference between how you treat you know, an herb like, you know, sage from your garden and how you'd process a wild herb to dry it. It's basically the same process.
Yes, and someone mentioned in the chat that if you have a lot of herbs, yes, you can use screens. So now we're talking herbalist level, you know, like or master forager level. But if you're, or maybe you want to make a salve and you need a lot of herbs, wild herbs, and so yes, you can use a screen, like a window screen for that. Make sure it's clean, because you don't want the herbs to dehydrate, contacting any dust or any, you know, any dirty materials, because once it's drying, when the leaves are moist, they can pretty much be like a magnet and attract whatever is in their environments. You really want to make sure. That's why air drying is best, because nothing's really sticking to it as it dries.
Mm-hmm. And how do you recommend storing dried herbs?
Glass containers away from sunlight, airtight. So this is not very airtight, but I have all my herbs in a cabinet, so it kind of has more barriers. But if you don't have a lot of dry containers, you can use a plastic bag that you upcycle, or just make sure that it's airtight. Airtight really extends the life, and also the chlorophyll. Air does a lot of damage to the herb, and over time, the herb will not be as bright as it used to be, but it'll still have minerals. So you really can't get, so you might not have active vitamins, which happens in the cooking process. When you're cooking with herbs, you want to sometimes add herbs last if you're looking for the vitamins, because vitamins are very delicate, especially with an oil, with a water infusion. But with minerals, you can't get rid of the elements, so you can't cook them down. That's why broths are awesome. That's, so you have a lot of like stocks that are wholesome because of the minerals, but not because of the antioxidants, which are fickle to heat.
Mm-hmm. Some folks are asking about using freeze-dried herbs. Is there a difference in the storage or use of freeze-dried herbs?
I don't freeze dry. I don't know if Russ does. So I personally don't freeze dry. I do a lot of things old fashioned, and I try to promote old fashioned ways, because I think that to be resilient in today's world, and in a world that we have pressing concerns with our climate, and we have pressing concerns with healthcare, pressing concerns with food access, food insecurity, I really feel that maybe some of it can be mitigated by basic home economics, lost arts that we've lost. And so I'm all about reviving lost arts, and that is, becoming more self-sufficient and health-sufficient. And these are things that it is indigenous knowledge, but at some point we were all indigenous people, and at some point we foraged. And so I really think that going back to the way we used to be symbiotic with nature and support nature, and nature supported us and respected nature, I think that we need to cultivate these skills again and revive these skills and revive home economics.
Another question came in earlier about using fresh leaves, in particular mullein leaves, for a hot water infusion or oil infusion. Would it work to use fresh leaves?
Yes, what I've learned in herbalist training is that when you're using fresh herbs, because there's already moisture in the plant, the infusion is not going to be as intense as using dry herb. So, if you're in a pinch and you have plenty of fresh herbs, use the fresh herbs, but know that, if you dehydrate it, and sometimes those properties are going to be more active and much stronger. It's just kind of like think something's already watered down, right? It's less concentrated. But, and there's sometimes reasons why you want to use fresh. I'm just always thinking practicality. Like, we live in New England, we only have so much of a growing season. And so I'm thinking, like, how do I extend the shelf life of certain foods, wild foods? And that's by dehydrating them. Or canning them, right? You make a meal that you can with herbs, and that way you have it for longer shelf storage.
Mm-hmm. Another question came in about making alcohol tinctures, and if you do you make alcohol tinctures, and if so, is it stronger if you soak it longer?
In herbalism, there's a reason for why you do what you do when, right? So when you're using alcohol, usually it's for more chronic cases. And also it's a way of preserving food. So when I say more chronic cases, it's because the alcohol will actually, the active chemicals will bind to the alcohol, and it'll make it go straight to the bloodstream much faster. And so, and sometimes, depending on the alcohol, it can actually, cross the blood-brain barrier. So sometimes you may start with a hot water infusion. Maybe that's not working. Maybe you might try doing like more concentrated, like let's say like herbal concoction where you're eating more of the herb. Like think of your capsules. Your capsules are just dehydrated powder in it, but maybe you might take something, a drink where it's a more concentrated amount of the herb, which is not very pleasant tasting, but it's very effective. And then maybe that's not working, so maybe you might upgrade to the tincture. But you can also, if you don't want to use alcohol, you can use glycerin, like for instance for babies or for children or for people that don't want to use alcohol, want to take alcohol. But the purpose usually for alcohol is one, preservation, and two, because it functions much faster by going into the bloodstream. So let's say somebody's in a lot of pain or dealing with something, a lot of discomfort. Maybe you want to have a valerian tincture. You know, that's going to help calm the nervous system, going to dull the pain a little bit. Maybe a white willow tincture. It'll go, you can still take the white willow. It's just a difference of one's going to function maybe within half an hour, or the other one's going to function within, you know, an hour or longer.
And to that, someone asked if they put their pine needles last spring in vodka and let it sit in their fridge without straining it, and is it still good?
I think it is. I think it's just going to be very potent. Some people don't like bitter. And actually, I think that we should. I won't say should. I have very strong opinions. I think it's good to become more accepting of bitter taste. We have way more bitter receptors on our tongue than we do any other flavor, and they're underutilized. And bitter is very good for our gallbladder, and some people have their gallbladder removed. And so if you're not excreting bile, where are you getting that bitter substance to break down fatty foods? And if you think of high holidays, when people ate meats or fatty foods, they were eating them with bitter herbs. And so we've sort of like lost this balance of how, when you eat bitter and how often you should eat bitter. And bitter is really something that we need all the time, especially when we're eating fatty foods. It's really a flavor that we need to incorporate more. And maybe, you know, I haven't done this research, but I think it would be fascinating research to say, you know, can most ailments be because we're not eating bitter foods anymore? Because when you think of bitter foods, what are you thinking of? Dark leafy vegetables, you know, like, and also older age vegetables, you know, like summer and fall vegetables. When you're eating young leaves, they're not as bitter, they're more mild. So I think, and I think also the bitter is because the elements, the minerals from the soil, they're more concentrated. So, hey, you know, think of it maybe as the mild version is less nutritious and the bitter version is more nutritious.
Thank you. And there's an interesting thread here talking about, in a way, propagating some of these wild edibles, in particular about purslane. And so I'd just like to hear your thoughts about, you know, propagating some of these things, and maybe in the case of purslane, would it be worth growing in our garden some of the cultivated varieties?
I'll take a shot at that. So usually it's the opposite input I get on purslane is, okay, it's edible, fine, but I have way, way too much in my garden. How do I have less purslane? And the problem is probably how folks are weeding it out of the garden, because for most weeds, you yank it out of the garden, you throw it off to the side, you say, okay, I've taken care of that plant. That does not work for purslane because, as you know, it's a succulent. So it's got all kinds of reserve moisture in those plant tissues. And so when the plant is uprooted, it gets a message and it slams into overdrive and it quickly accelerates its life process and it quickly goes to forming flowers and forming viable seeds before the plant dies. You're actually helping to propagate the plant by weeding it that way, rather than putting it in a separate area away from your garden. That's what you want to do if you want to have less of it. And if you want to have more of it, just wait till the summer, find any purslane and just do what I suggest. Just, you know, heave it up next to your field and you will have it next year.
And Shannon asked if there's anything that could be misidentified as purslane.
Well, you know, people have different abilities of identifying plants. Some people just see green, you know, if it's green, they just lump all green things together. And other folks have the ability to discern one plant from another. I think purslane is rather distinctive because the leaves are spatulate, you know, they widen out as you go toward the tip, like a spatula does. And they're very fleshy and succulent. And there just aren't a lot of plants that look that way. in the garden. So I think that's actually pretty distinctive weed.
Yeah, as Russ said, maybe you might want to snap a little bit of a section, and if it's oozing, you know, as a succulent, it's going to be oozing. It's going to have a lot of moisture. So there is a plant that some people might mistake it as purslane. I don't know the name of it, but it does not look like it at all. It's just like this kind of like spirally long plant that's very thin. It has a red stem, but if you can't even snap it, it's like a string. It's like really hard to snap it, but purslane will just snap and it'll make a sound and it'll ooze. So that's how one way you can tell it apart.
Yeah, purslane, I mean, it has that mucilaginous quality that you discover just by, you know, putting in your mouth briefly, and also will have a tart kind of a lemony flavor in the raw state too.
And back to white pine needles, can they be dried and used in teas, or should they really be used fresh?
Go ahead, Priscilla.
I think if you're in a pinch in the winter time, that's more indigenous knowledge. I don't know a lot of indigenous herbs. I know that I have foraged for pine needles in the winter time because they're a very high source of vitamin C, but I don't feel comfortable speaking too much on pine needles because there are a lot of different types of evergreens. And so I don't want to say go forage some pine and then maybe someone's going to get pine needles that are not necessarily, you know, edible. But I would say that that's more indigenous knowledge. I know more like herbs that I grew up with and studied for their specific, I mean, that would be more survival. I mean, I know some survival herbs, but I know more herbs for actually healing externally and internally the body than necessarily for survival.
So when people talk about pine needles, they're talking about the white pine, the needles that are in bunches of 5. I find those, I mean, that's the most common pine tree in Massachusetts, and they're pretty easy to tell them apart from the other kinds. And the pine needles are thin and very soft. And, you know, they're there year round. So there probably isn't any reason to, you know, feel like you need to have a supply of dried ones, unless I guess you're in the city and it would be quite a trip to go find a pine tree. But most people, I think, wouldn't have to work that hard to find a pine tree and just collect fresh needles and use them that way.
And there's a couple of comments about wild carrots and poison hemlock and Queen Anne's lace and how they're related. Is that something you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I can take that one. So, you know, in having just a 30-minute talk, I had to leave so much stuff out. And so, you know, wild carrot and Queen Anne's lace, first of all, it's the same exact species. And it's a biennial like the burdock that I talked about in the show. So it has a 2-year life cycle. And a general principle for all biennial root crops is the root is going to be the best between the first and second growing seasons. That's when the max amount of food energy is going to be in there. That's when it's going to be the tastiest. And so the time to harvest a wild carrot is not when the white Queen Anne's lace flower is on there, because it's too late then. The root was used up to make the flower. So you need to be able to recognize the plant just from the foliage. And this is where it gets tricky. In fact, it's even tricky when the white flower is on there, because yes, poison hemlock is a cousin of wild carrot, and it does look a lot alike. And so, and poison hemlock is potentially lethal. And so, yeah, you don't want to make a mistake. Now, one of the things I advise people to do, any root that you think is wild carrot, give it a scrape and give it a sniff. And you need to get a no doubt about it, this is a carrot smell. It can't smell like parsnips or anything else. If it smells like a carrot with a capital C, then I think you confidently can say that it's wild carrot, because poison hemlock and water hemlock, another deadly poisons look alike, don't have that smell. But when in doubt, like if you don't have a strong smeller, my advice is just avoid it. I don't even think wild carrots are that good anyway. If I have access to regular cultivated carrots, I'd use them every time over wild carrot. The only time I could imagine using a wild carrot is if, let's say, I was backpacking and I was away from any stores and I was making a soup and, oh darn, I forgot the carrots, and you find some wild carrots, then maybe I would use them then.
And as we're coming near the end, I think now is a great time to talk a little bit about some of the resources that you really turn to the most. Someone asked specifically about any good plant ID apps, I believe probably for their phone or smartphone or tablet. Do you have any recommendations on that side of things?
Well, the one I'm most familiar with is iNaturalist, that is for all things out there, so plants and everything else too. And it's mostly good. I've seen it make mistakes, and in general, I would not be a big flag waver for apps where you're thinking about eating something that you're identifying in an app, because that's a little different than like bird watching. And if you make a mistake and you think it's one bird, it's actually another bird. I mean, there's no adverse impacts to your health from doing that. But if you're trying to ID a plant from an app, the risk of ingesting the wrong thing, I think, is significant. So an app might be one of several things I'd use. I mean, the fact is, I love to do the outdoor in-person walks, because then you get to see the actual plants in real life, real time. You get to see the kind of habitats they grow in. You get to see the plants they grow in association with. And so, now that we're coming out of the pandemic, I hope that I and my fellow other wild edibles instructors be able to get out in the field and do the in-person, in situ teaching, which I think is the most useful to build your confidence level about identifying and finding the right thing. In the meantime, for the plants that you do feel confident that you can identify, like dandelion, for example, dandelion is a great plant. It's going to be in season in very short time. So I'd take that on as my immediate project. And, or stinging nettle, you get stung, you have stinging nettle. So those are two easy ones that are going to be available really soon.
Yeah, I don't have an app that I can recommend. I also agree that it's hard if you are a beginning in foraging. I mean, what I've learned from teachers, right? And then eventually I started sharing what I was making. But most of my education has come from other herbalists, foragers. I've even attended workshops that Russ has given. So, it's something that I would highly recommend that we go back to this teacher-student relationship, where we're following practitioners of a craft. We're learning from them as they pass down their knowledge, and then the cycle repeats itself. And this is something that's still kept alive in Japan. You have the shokunin, the master chef, the person who's mastered, and then you have these apprentices that stay with them, sometimes even decades, until they too become a master apprentice, a master, a shokunin, a master in their craft. And then, you have a new cycle of apprentices. I also agree that some of the best lessons are experiential, but we are in a digital world and we are in a digital economy. So, if I have any questions about something, I'm part of several ID groups on Facebook. I think when you have that interaction, you have like 200 people telling you, yes, this, no, and so it's a lot more interactive. You get very fast feedback. There are a lot of master foragers on these ID groups, and also a lot of young people that are getting into the craft. And so I like it for its interactiveness, to challenge my brain. I'm also learning herbs that I don't use in my practice. So yeah, I would recommend the Facebook groups.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question specifically, again, for Russ to mention the walks that you may potentially lead. How would we find out more information about that?
Okay, so I'll share my screen again.
Sure.
And let's see. Go to the end here. Okay. Last slide. Okay, you seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, so it's this URL right here. I apologize, I do not have a domain name. So it's this long thing. If that's too long for you to remember, you could just type Russ Cohen into Google and you should go straight to my site. And this is where I post all my public wild edibles programs, whether it's online or in person, whether it's a slideshow or a walk. It's all there. And I'm still working on arrangements with different sponsors. So what's up there, I'm still calling it a preliminary list, because I still, will have a few more that will show up there. So if you don't see a walk on there at a time and a location that's convenient for you, check the site again periodically, and maybe something will pop up that will work for you.
Great. And I just copied and pasted your contact information into the chat as well. So folks,
Okay, great.
your email. Again, thank you so much for all the time and all that great insight and information. Thanks for all your participation tonight. I hope you found this meeting informative. We would love your feedback. So there's a link to an evaluation that will come in the chat and as well in a follow-up email. Again, please make a donation or become a sustaining member if you love the work that we do. Thanks again to our sponsors, Chelsea Green and Ward's Nursery. Thank you very much from everyone at NOFA Mass. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Good night, everybody. Happy foraging.